Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a story filled with intense action, mystery, and emotion. This story follows Marcus Carter, a former renowned fighter who only wanted a quiet evening, blending into the city without being noticed. But fate had other plans. It placed him in a situation he simply couldn't ignore. At an old, rundown bus stop in the heart of Raven Hollow, a city shrouded in mystery and darkness, Marcus encounters a frail elderly woman in need of help. Without hesitation, he offers her his seat, an act of kindness that should have been simple. But just as he does, a dangerous gang led by Rico emerges, bringing with them intimidation and malice. These bullies believe they can control everything through fear. But Marcus is not the kind of man to back down. A confrontation ignites, a battle between justice and crime, between light and darkness. What will happen next? Can Marcus overcome the lurking dangers hidden within the night? Is kindness strong enough to stand against cruelty? Join us as we unravel this thrilling journey, filled with action, emotion, and pulse-pounding moments. The neon lights of Raven Hollow flickered against the darkened streets, casting eerie shadows that danced along the cracked pavement. It was a city known for its secrets, where whispers of strange occurrences drifted through the air like a chilling breeze. Tonight, Marcus, the Titan Carter, walked these streets, not as the world-renowned wrestler, not as the action star whose name filled theater marquees, but as a man searching for solitude. He pulled the hood of his coat over his head, his broad shoulders hunched slightly to avoid drawing attention. Dressed in a plain black hoodie, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, he blended into the sea of faceless strangers navigating the late-night streets. No cameras, no flashing lights, no screaming fans. Just him, the city, and the unsettling silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Marcus had spent years in the limelight, adored by millions, but the fame had become suffocating. He longed for something different, something real. One night to be unseen, to feel what it was like to be just another man walking the streets. But as he moved deeper into the city, a gnawing sensation settled in his gut. Something was wrong. Raven Hollow had always been eerie, but tonight, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick, colder than it should have been. The street lamps flickered in and out as if struggling to stay lit. A thin layer of mist crept along the ground, curling around his boots like grasping fingers. Every step he took echoed unnaturally, as though the city itself was listening. Then, he noticed it. At first, it was just a shadow, flickering in the corner of his eye, vanishing the moment he turned his head. Then came the feeling, like something watching him, something lurking just beyond his line of sight. He stopped at a street corner, glancing at the dimly lit alleys stretching into darkness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Someone was following him. Marcus didn't react immediately. Years of fighting had trained him to stay calm under pressure. He took a slow breath, adjusting his pace, his ears tuning in to the rhythm of the city. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, just a second behind his own. Whoever it was, they were careful, but not careful enough. He turned the next corner sharply, stepping into the shadows of a closed storefront, his back pressed against the cool brick wall. The sound of footsteps hesitated, then continued, closer now. Marcus's muscles tensed. A figure stepped into view, a tall man in a long coat, his face hidden beneath a deep hood. He paused at the corner, head tilting slightly as if sensing Marcus's presence. The air between them crackled with tension. Marcus narrowed his eyes. He had come out tonight looking for anonymity, but something told him that fate had other plans. Whatever was lurking in the darkness of Raven Hollow had found him, and it wasn't about to let him walk away unnoticed. With a steady breath, Marcus pulled his hood lower, stepped back into the street, and continued his path. But this time, he wasn't just walking. He was preparing. The bus stop loomed ahead, its lone, flickering street lamp casting distorted shadows on the cracked concrete below. The mist that had been slithering along the ground grew denser here, swirling around Marcus Carter's boots like unseen hands reaching for him. He didn't like the way the air felt. Too heavy, too still. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. Marcus slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the nearly empty bus stop. A single metal bench sat beneath the broken streetlight, its chipped paint and rusted edges a testament to years of neglect. And sitting there, barely illuminated by the dim glow, was a frail old woman. She was hunched over, clutching a cane with gnarled fingers, her tattered coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. Two heavy grocery bags rested at her feet, their contents barely visible through the worn plastic. She shifted uncomfortably, her breathing labored as if every movement was a struggle. Something about her felt wrong. It wasn't just her frailty or the way she sat so still. It was the unnatural quiet surrounding her. The usual city noise, the distant honking of cars, the chatter of late-night wanderers, had faded away, leaving only an eerie silence. Marcus took a cautious step forward. She lifted her head slightly at the sound of his approaching footsteps. Her eyes, sunken and clouded with age, locked onto his. For a moment, Marcus felt an odd sense of déjà vu, like he had seen those eyes before. But that was impossible. Still, he felt something stir in his chest. An instinct, a pull toward the woman. He had no reason to care, no obligation to stop, but he did. With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus approached the bench and stood beside her. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The old woman didn't answer at first. Instead, she stared at him, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "The bus! I need the bus!" Marcus glanced down the road. Nothing. The street was empty, stretching into the darkness like an endless void. He frowned. "It'll be here soon," he assured her. Then, without hesitation, he gestured toward the empty spot beside her. "Take my seat." The woman blinked as if surprised by his offer. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she shifted and settled onto the bench. A deep, weary sigh escaped her lips, and for a brief moment, the tension in her shoulders eased. "Thank you," she murmured, barely audible. Marcus nodded, stepping back. His instincts still screamed at him that something wasn't right, but he pushed the thought aside. It was just an old woman waiting for a bus, nothing more. Then, movement. From the shadows at the far end of the bus stop, something shifted. A figure emerged, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a long, tattered coat. His face was obscured by the angle of the flickering light, but Marcus could see the way he moved, slow, calculated, like a predator sizing up its prey. The air grew colder. Marcus's jaw tightened. He had given up his seat to the old woman, but suddenly, standing in the open under the failing light, he felt like he had just stepped into a trap. The moment the old woman settled into the bench, a chilling shift in the atmosphere sent a prickle down Marcus Carter's spine. It was subtle at first, like a whisper in the dark, a silent warning woven into the cold night air. Then, from the far end of the bus stop, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, and heavy with intent. Marcus turned his head just as a figure emerged from the shadows. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in a long, tattered coat that barely concealed the bulk of his frame. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a hood, but the cruel smirk on his lips was unmistakable. He wasn't alone. 3 more figures slithered out of the darkness behind him, their presence turning the once empty bus stop into a pressure cooker of silent menace. Marcus didn't flinch, but his muscles coiled instinctively, ready. The leader, Rico, stepped forward, his boots scraping against the concrete as he surveyed the scene before him. His eyes, dark and calculating, flicked to the old woman, then landed on Marcus. A slow grin spread across his face, and there was something unnervingly hollow in his expression, something not entirely human. "Well, well," Rico drawled, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "Looks like we got ourselves a good Samaritan." His three goons chuckled under their breath, the sound low and guttural. Marcus remained silent, watching. Rico took another step closer, hands tucked into his coat pockets. You know that seat you just gave up? He jerked his chin toward the old woman. That's mine. Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He'd dealt with men like Rico before. Predators who fed off fear, who thrived on intimidation. But there was something different about this one. Something wrong. She needed it more, Marcus said simply. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Rico chuckled, shaking his head like he had just heard the punchline of a joke. That's so? His eyes gleamed under the dim streetlight. See, the problem with that is, I don't like being disrespected. One of the goons shifted closer, the creak of leather punctuating the silence. The old woman let out a quiet, shaky breath, shrinking into her coat. Marcus rolled his shoulders. Not my problem. Rico's smirk widened. Oh, but it is. With a snap of his fingers, one of his men lunged forward, fast, reaching for Marcus's shoulder. But Marcus had already moved. In a blur of motion, he sidestepped, catching the man's wrist mid-grab. A single twist sent a sickening pop through the air, followed by a strangled yelp. The goon crumpled, clutching his now useless arm. The other two hesitated. Rico's grin faltered, but his eyes burned with something dark, something eager. Well now, he mused. Looks like we got ourselves a fighter. The night had just turned deadly. The air around the bus stop grew heavier, charged with an unseen force, like the moment before a storm unleashes its fury. Marcus Carter held his stance, eyes locked onto Rico's cold, predatory gaze. The leader of the gang exuded an aura of twisted amusement, his smirk curling as he studied Marcus like a cat watching a cornered mouse. But Marcus wasn't the one cornered. The old woman shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her frail hands tightening around the cane resting on her lap. Her breaths were shallow, her presence nearly forgotten as tension thickened around them. She was afraid. Marcus could feel it, and he hated that. You don't want to do this, Marcus said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the silence like a blade. Rico tilted his head, almost amused. Oh, and why's that, big guy? Marcus didn't blink. Because if you push this any further, you won't like how it ends. The street lamp overhead flickered again, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the pavement. For a brief second, Rico's face twisted in the shifting light, his grin stretching wider than it should, his eyes seeming darker, almost hollow. The moment passed as quickly as it came, but Marcus saw it, and he knew. Something was very, very wrong. But Rico either didn't notice or didn't care. He let out a short, dry chuckle. You talk a big game, he said, taking a slow step forward. But let me tell you something, hero. This is my city, my turf. I don't give a damn who you think you are. Out here, we make the rules. Marcus inhaled deeply, exhaled slow, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He didn't want to fight. Not here. Not now. But men like Rico, they never knew when to walk away. The remaining two goons took a step forward, flanking their leader, emboldened by his arrogance. The one with the injured arm still writhed on the ground, groaning in pain. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, eyes scanning their movements. He had spent his entire life in combat, both in and out of the ring. He recognized the way their muscles tensed, the way their eyes flicked between each other, searching for an opening. They were about to strike. He sighed. I'll say this one more time, Marcus warned, his voice even. Walk away. Rico's grin widened. Make me. The wind howled through the empty streets. The mist thickened, curling around their feet. Marcus clenched his jaw. And then, like a trigger being pulled, the night erupted. The night air thickened, charged with an unseen energy that set every nerve in Marcus Carter's body on edge. The street lamp flickered again, casting jagged shadows across the pavement, as if the city itself sensed the violence brewing. Rico took another slow step forward, rolling his shoulders, exuding the smug confidence of a man who believed he owned the streets beneath his feet. His remaining two lackeys closed in on either side, their footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. The old woman on the bench let out a shaky breath, gripping her cane with frail fingers, eyes darting between the men surrounding her. The fear in her posture was palpable. Marcus didn't move. He had faced men like Rico before. Street thugs who thrived on intimidation, who preyed on the weak, who believed that fear was a currency they could spend freely. But there was something different about this man. The way he moved, the way his shadow stretched unnaturally long under the flickering light. Something about him was just wrong. Rico smirked. "I don't think you get it, Titan," he said, emphasizing the name mockingly. "This isn't about some old lady in a damn seat. This is about respect." Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Respect. His voice was even, calm, but laced with an underlying threat. "Is that what you call harassing an old woman?" Rico chuckled darkly. "Nah. Respect is about knowing your place." Then, in one smooth motion, he pulled a cigarette from his coat pocket, flicked open a lighter, and took a slow, deliberate drag. The moment the smoke curled from his lips, Marcus caught the sharp change in the air. The scent wasn't that of ordinary tobacco. It was acrid, unnatural, something that made the hair on his arms stand on end. It smelled like burnt wood, like scorched earth after a wildfire. She gasped. Rico turned, locked eyes with the old woman, and, without hesitation, blew a thick stream of smoke directly into her face. Our frail body convulsing, as if the very air had turned against her. Her hands shot up, clawing at the invisible toxin, eyes watering, chest rising and falling, in short, panicked breaths. The bags at her feet crinkled as she doubled over, racked with uncontrollable coughing. Marcus moved. He didn't think. He reacted. In the blink of an eye, he swiped the cigarette straight from Rico's hand and crushed it under his boot with a sharp, deliberate stomp. The ember hissed, a tiny spark extinguished beneath his heel. For a moment, the bus stop was utterly still. Then, Rico's smirk vanished. His lips twitched. His fingers curled into fists. "Oh," he whispered, almost playfully. "That's how it is, huh?" Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "That's how it is." The energy in the air shifted, the mist curling tighter around them, the street lamp flickering wildly as if struggling to hold back the encroaching darkness. And then, in a sudden burst of motion, Rico lunged. The street lamp above flickered wildly, its light sputtering as if caught in a silent struggle against the encroaching darkness. The mist curling around the bus stop thickened, swirling like a living thing, stretching long, claw-like tendrils across the cracked pavement. Marcus Carter stood unmoving, his jaw tight, eyes locked onto Rico, who had gone deathly still. And then, without warning, Rico struck. It happened fast, faster than it should have. One moment he was standing there, grinning, his fingers twitching with anticipation. The next, his fist was already in motion, a blur in the dim light, swinging straight for the back of Marcus's head. A cheap shot. A dirty move. Marcus barely had time to register the sudden rush of air before the impact landed. A brutal, unexpected strike aimed at the base of his skull. His vision momentarily blurred as the force of the blow sent him stumbling forward. His boots scraped against the pavement, the sharp sting of the hit buzzing through his nerves. The bus stop erupted into chaos. The old woman let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she shrank into the bench, eyes wide with terror. The two remaining lackeys snarled, stepping forward like wolves sensing blood in the water. Rico threw his head back and laughed, the sound thick with triumph. "What happened, big guy?" he taunted. "Didn't see that one coming?" Marcus took a slow, steady breath. His body had been trained to endure punishment. Years in the ring. Years of fights in places where there were no referees, no rules. He had taken hits that would have dropped lesser men. This question mark. This was nothing. Still, his back tensed as he straightened, rolling his shoulders, his head tilting slightly as if checking for damage. He could feel the heat of the blow radiating through his skull. But more than that, he could feel something deeper. Not pain, not anger. Something colder, something dangerous. Marcus turned slowly, deliberately, until his gaze locked onto Rico's. The gang leader's smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second. But Marcus saw it. The tiny flicker of doubt, the hesitation in Rico's stance, the way his fingers twitched at his sides as if he was already bracing for retaliation. Good. Marcus exhaled through his nose. His voice when he spoke was calm, too calm. You shouldn't have done that. The laughter died in Rico's throat. A nervous glance passed between his lackeys, their amusement quickly fading. They had seen plenty of fights before. They had seen men get beaten down, grovel, beg for mercy. But Marcus Carter? He wasn't backing down. He wasn't even angry. He was just waiting. Rico snarled, masking his uncertainty with bravado. He squared his shoulders, lips curling into another mocking grin. "You're real tough, huh?" he sneered. "Think you're some kind of hero?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in the next heartbeat, he moved. And this time, he struck first. The moment hung suspended in time. The flickering street lamp cast jagged, shifting shadows as the mist thickened around the bus stop, swallowing the city's distant noises into an eerie void. Rico's smirk still lingered, but the confidence behind it was already fading. He had expected Marcus to stumble, to clutch his head in pain, maybe even to back down. But Marcus Carter wasn't like other men. He wasn't backing down. He was about to end this. Marcus didn't lunge. He didn't telegraph his next move with rage or reckless aggression. He simply moved, fast, efficient, deadly. His right hand shot forward, grabbing Rico by the front of his jacket. Before the gang leader could react, Marcus yanked him forward with the raw, terrifying strength of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of controlled destruction. Rico barely had time to register what was happening before a massive fist buried itself deep into his gut. The sound was sickening. A sharp, guttural wheeze tore from Rico's throat as all the air in his lungs was forcibly expelled. His knees buckled, his body folding over Marcus's arm as pain exploded through his core. Marcus didn't stop there. With brutal efficiency, he twisted, using Rico's own momentum to spin him around before slamming him back first against the rusted metal bus stop pole. The entire structure rattled from the impact, the sign overhead creaking as Rico let out a choked grunt, his fingers clawing at Marcus's grip. The gang leader's cocky bravado was gone. Now there was only shock and fear. The two remaining goons hesitated. Their leader, the one who always talked big, the one who ruled these streets with intimidation and force, was crumpling like wet paper in Marcus Carter's hands. They had a choice. They could run, or they could fight. Unfortunately for them, they made the wrong choice. One of them rushed forward, a switchblade flashing in his hand. The dim glow of the street lamp reflected off the blade's edge as he lunged, aiming straight for Marcus's ribs. Marcus didn't even flinch. With almost lazy precision, he sidestepped, his left arm snapping out to catch the attacker's wrist mid-strike. A single crushing squeeze sent the knife clattering to the ground. Before the goon could react, Marcus twisted his arm at an unnatural angle. Crack! A strangled cry of pain echoed through the bus stop as the thug crumpled to the pavement, clutching his now useless arm. The last goon took a step back, his confidence shattered. His wide eyes darted between Marcus and Rico, who was still gasping for air, hunched over, one hand pressed against his ribs. Marcus turned his attention back to Rico, his voice as steady as stone. "I warned you." Rico tried to speak, but nothing came out. Only a weak, wheezing gasp. His legs wobbled as he tried to push himself off the pole, but Marcus didn't let him go. Instead, he yanked him close, their faces inches apart. "You want respect?" Marcus growled. "Then earn it." With that, he shoved Rico backward, sending him stumbling to the ground. The bus stop was silent except for the labored breathing of the gang, the old woman's quiet gasps of shock, and the distant hum of the city beyond. The fight wasn't over yet. But now, the tide had turned. The silence that followed was thick with tension, a razor's edge poised to cut through the night. The gang had come in full force, expecting an easy show of dominance. Instead, their leader was on the ground, gasping for breath, and one of their own lay moaning in agony, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The last thug standing hesitated, his body rigid with indecision. He had two choices: run or fight. The answer should have been obvious. Instead, he chose poorly. With a guttural yell meant more to psych himself up than to strike fear, he charged. His movements were reckless, desperate, a man trying to reclaim a sliver of control. in a situation spiraling out of his grasp. Marcus Carter was done playing defense. He moved with terrifying precision, sidestepping the charging thug in a blink. In one smooth motion, Marcus hooked an arm around the man's throat, using his own momentum against him. The thug's eyes bulged as Marcus tightened his grip, cutting off his breath. Then, with raw, effortless strength, Marcus lifted him off the ground. For a moment, the thug hung there, kicking, gurgling. Marcus's muscles flexed as he shifted his weight, pivoted, and drove the man straight into the pavement. The impact was bone-rattling. The air left the thug's lungs in a single strangled gasp before his body went limp. 2 down. Rico, still gasping from Marcus's earlier strike, coughed and forced himself onto his elbows. The smug arrogance that had been plastered across his face earlier was gone, replaced with something much uglier, fear. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. The first thug he had taken down, the one clutching his broken arm, had managed to pull himself together just enough to grab a discarded steel pipe lying near the edge of the bus stop. His face contorted with pain and fury as he lunged forward, gripping the pipe with both hands, swinging it toward Marcus's skull. Marcus heard it before he saw it. The whisper of metal slicing through air. He spun, his instincts honed by years of combat, and raised his forearm just in time to deflect the strike. The force of the impact sent vibrations up his arm, but he barely felt it. Instead, he grabbed the pipe mid-swing, wrenching it from the thug's hands with a single brutal yank. The thug stumbled, eyes wide. Marcus didn't give him time to recover. He reversed his grip on the pipe, swung low, and struck the thug's legs out from under him. The man crashed to the ground with a pained yell, but Marcus wasn't done. He brought the pipe down hard, stopping just inches from the thug's heaving chest. The steel rang out as it struck pavement, the sound a final warning. The thug froze. His entire body trembled as he stared up at Marcus, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Stay down," Marcus growled. The thug obeyed. Rico, watching the carnage unfold, swallowed hard. He pushed himself to his feet, staggering slightly, his hand clutching his ribs. Marcus turned to him, eyes dark, shoulders squared. It was just the two of them now. The king of the streets had just lost his army. The night air was thick with the scent of sweat and fear. The flickering street lamp above the bus stop cast eerie, shifting shadows over the scene. 3 men lay groaning on the pavement, one clutching his shattered arm, another barely conscious from the brutal slam Marcus had delivered. The last thug lay sprawled, his breath shallow, too terrified to move. And then there was Rico. The so-called leader of the gang stood trembling, his chest rising and falling in uneven, ragged breaths. His ribs ached where Marcus had driven a fist into them. His pride was in even worse shape. His boys were out cold, and now the whole world seemed to close in around him, suffocating him under the weight of his own failure. Marcus Carter took a slow step forward. Rico flinched. The once cocky gang leader, the man who had ruled this part of the city through fear and intimidation, now looked like a cornered animal. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling, as if debating whether to fight or flee. But the truth was, he knew he was already beaten. Marcus's voice was low, controlled, but there was an unmistakable force behind it. "Apologize." Rico's lip curled, a last desperate attempt to hold on to some shred of defiance. "For what?" he spat, though his voice lacked the confidence it once held. Marcus's gaze darkened. "For her," he said simply, tilting his head toward the old woman, who still sat hunched on the bench, clutching her cane with white-knuckled fingers. Rico hesitated. His breath came quicker now, his pulse hammering in his ears. Around them, the city had gone eerily silent, as if the very streets were waiting to see what he would do. Marcus took another step forward. Rico instinctively stepped back. The message was clear. There was no running from this. The gang leader clenched his jaw so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. Humiliation burned in his chest, hotter than any wound Marcus had inflicted. His entire life, he had built his reputation on fear, on power. But now, all of it was crumbling. And worse, everyone who had witnessed his downfall would remember this night forever. Marcus waited. The silence stretched. Finally, Rico dropped his gaze. His shoulders slumped, his fingers twitching uselessly at his sides. And then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, "I'm sorry." Marcus didn't move. Louder. Rico's hands balled into fists, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to fight, to lash out, to reclaim some control. But it was over. He had lost. He took a shaky breath, then forced the words out. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice rough and bitter. "I shouldn't have done that." The old woman, still gripping her cane, didn't speak, but the smallest hint of relief flickered across her tired eyes. Marcus nodded once. The job was done. Rico's empire had fallen, and he had no one to blame but himself. Rico stood there, humiliated, his face twisted with bitterness as the words of apology left his lips. The gang leader, once feared, once untouchable, now looked small, broken. His men lay scattered around him, groaning in pain, their bodies sprawled across the pavement like discarded chess pieces after a lost game. But the night wasn't finished with him yet. The distant wail of sirens pierced the heavy silence, growing louder with each passing second. The flashing red and blue lights painted the cracked pavement in eerie streaks of color, the rhythmic pulse of justice closing in. Marcus Carter didn't move. He stood tall, his breathing steady, his presence still radiating the controlled strength that had dismantled an entire gang in mere minutes. His eyes remained locked on Rico, watching as realization dawned in the gang leader's face. This wasn't just a loss. This was the end. Rico's eyes darted around, wild and desperate. He looked at his fallen men, then at Marcus, then at the approaching squad cars. His chest rose and fell in short, panicked breaths. This wasn't how this night was supposed to go. The first patrol car skidded to a stop, its doors flying open before the tires had even finished rolling. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the lingering mist. "Hands where we can see them!" one of them barked, his voice commanding. Rico hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Marcus to catch the thought flickering through his mind. He was going to run, not tonight.